I'm Donald Dabdut from the University of California, Irvine, and it is a great pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker this morning, Professor Nicole Reimer from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the Department of Atmospheric Sciences. Nicole's research interest is in the area of particle modeling, how they are created, transported, and transformed. In addition to this, she combines this modeling perspective with observational data to understand the impact on human health, on weather, and on climate. Her research skills have been recognized with many awards in excellence in research, and she has also been awarded repeatedly also by her excellence in teaching. In addition to that, Nicole is a great colleague and a good friend. She has this unique ability to bring the best in people, and I'm firsthand fortunate enough to have collaborated with her to have great fun and animated discussions about aerosols. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and I could not be more pleased to introduce our Friedlander lecture, which is titled Particle Result Modeling, a Bridge Between Scales in Aerosol Science. Nicole.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this plenary lecture. It's my great honor to give this lecture and to report about our work. Thank you, Donald, for your kind introduction. And yeah, so I'm going to talk about the work that we have been doing for many years now. A lot of people have been contributing to what I'm showing today, students, postdocs, and collaborators. And I will acknowledge them as we go along. And I also would like to thank our funding agencies that have making this work possible. Okay, I like to start with the big picture. This slide, many of us know this slide from the latest IPCC report, and prior IPCC reports had similar incarnations of this. It's showing the effective radiative forcing from pre-industrial times to the present. And of course, the greenhouse gases are warming, and the aerosols are offsetting this warming to some extent due to their interactions with clouds and their direct interactions with radiation. And what I would like to hone in today, though, is this error bar, which is not really a conventional error bar, it's just a model spread. So the different models that are producing these results don't agree. And they don't agree by a large margin. And we might want to ask ourselves in this community, how is this possible? We have been accomplishing so much. We understand the aerosols so much better now compared to 20 years ago. All these processes that we are going to hear about in this conference, why are these error bars still so large? And there are several reasons for this, but one of the reasons that we struggle with is this fact that we are dealing with a multiscale problem. And so that's not unique to aerosol science. Many areas in science struggle with this just as well. And so what's going on is we want to know a signal on the global scale. We want to know the radiative forcing for our large-scale system. But to understand this or to determine this, we really need to understand what's going on down to the particle scale and even down to the molecular scale at times. And this is really hard to do due to computational constraints. Even if we understand the processes well, even if we can write down the equations, it's hard to implement these things directly in a global model that has grid sizes of hundreds of kilometers at times. So that's part of the big problem. How are we going to do this? And so what are these processes that I'm referring to here? So if we imagine there's an aerosol population coming along, going over an area of where people live, where industry is going on, where farming is going on, we have all these processes acting at the same time, right? It's not just one type of aerosol that we need to track. We really need to have a good understanding of everything that's going on at the same time. And so it's a multi-phase system. So we have gas phase reaction producing gases that can condense on particles, forming coatings. The particles coagulate with each other, forming mixtures. We have aqueous phase chemistry going on in the clouds. And so these cloud droplets evaporate and release modified aerosols into the atmosphere. And we have, of course, primary emissions that are injected at any moment in time. And so it's this really complex mixture, which is actually really interesting scientifically, that we somehow have to capture the bottom line of. And so if we go out and sample at any moment in time, maybe outside even here in Portland, so Miriam Friedman supplied me these microscopy images, which I slightly photoshopped. We might find something like this. So this is what I would consider the aerosol state. So this is what we are up against if we want to implement our aerosols in models and see what is their impact on health and climate and weather. And so how are we going about this? And so when we talk about aerosol models, it can actually mean many different things, right? Depending on what kind of level of complexity your model is operating. The simplest way we may want to represent aerosols is what we call in bulk models, where we just track the bulk composition, simply mass concentration of the different constituents. And in my cartoon, I'm just showing 3 constituents, and in reality, of course, we have many more. So we lose track of all these details, different sizes, different shapes, the fact that the particles can be mixtures. We just track literally the bulk mass concentrations in any given location at any given point in time. The next more complex level of representing aerosols would be that we realize, okay, size is really important. No matter what impacts we might be interested in, optical properties, CCN properties, ice nucleation, inhaling into the lungs, being deposited, we really should be tracking size. So then we can say, okay, we do it by introducing overlapping distributions, which would give us the modal models, or we chop up over our overall size distribution into sections, which results in sectional models. And then what we gain is a size-resolved composition profile, which is much more detailed than the bulk models. And lastly, if you compare what our aerosol state actually looks like, you might realize, okay, in the sectional models and in the modal models, within one size bin or within one mode, we have to assume that all the particles look the same, which is not the case, right? If we pick out a certain size range and sample, there's actually quite a lot of diversity in composition and in shape also. And so the next level up, we could say, using particle resolved models, doing away with modes and bins, and literally represent our true aerosol state with computational particles that can evolve in time as aerosol processes are acting on them. Okay, and so bear with me as I'm explaining how to think about this aerosol state a little bit more. So what's happening is that if we take our model particles that in my cartoon can contain 3 species, right? Black carbon, sulfate, and organic carbon. In reality, of course, many more species can be present. They really are situated in this case, a 3-dimensional space, which we call the composition space, right? So you can see this 3-dimensional space is spanned by the amount of black carbon, amount of sulfate, and amount of organic carbon. And I can place each of these particles in this 3-dimensional space according to its composition. And then what this means is each particle can be represented simply by a vector, and each entry in my vector is how much stuff of each component I have. In our model, the composition space is of dimension 20, so much higher dimensional than 3. In reality, of course, if you are interested in many different organics, it may be actually much more high dimensional. So that's what we mean when we say composition space, and particles, the aerosol is spanning or is situated in a composition space. And then how are these more simplified models related? So they are actually low-dimensional projections of this high-dimensional composition space. And depending on how we do these projections, we are losing more or less detail about the real high-dimensional composition space. And with it comes structural uncertainty that we introduce in our model simulations. And so to motivate, why does this even matter? Why do we need to care about this? Think about a sample of monodispersed particles, and so I drew, actually Andy Alt drew these for our paper from a while ago. This illustrates the fact that we can distribute our chemical species in different ways across a monodispersed population, right? On the left, we see what we would consider an external mixture, that our, in this case, two species, ammonium sulfate and some hydrophobic organic, are residing separately in individual particles, so that would be the external mixture. The internal mixture is the opposite, where each particle contains a mixture of both constituents, and because we have even amounts in this case, each particle contains half ammonium sulfate, half organics, and then in the real world, we are somewhere in between. And so if you are, for example, interested in CCN activation questions, this may really matter, right? So if you expose each of these populations to a certain supersaturation, in the external mixture, only the ammonium sulfate might activate, right? And so the organics, they are too hydrophobic. So you get a CCN to CN ratio of 50%. In the middle case, where each particle contains some hygroscopic species, all of them activate, so you would get a ratio of 100%. And in reality, you might be somewhere in between. And so the more simplified modal and sectional models, even though they are computationally much more efficient compared to particle-based models, they are distribution-based, and they have this inherent assumption that all particles in one mode and one bin have the same composition. And therefore, the way the constituent species are distributed, which we call the mixing state, is something that is not accessible to them, right? We just need to make assumptions. It's a structural uncertainty of the model. And so to finish up this intro about how should we think about the aerosol space, I think the aerosol state and the composition space, the analogy to the elephant is appropriate. So depending on from which angle we look at the elephant, we might think, and we don't see the full picture, we might think, oh, it's a snake, or it's a spear, or it's a tree, or it's a rope. And this applies to the aerosols as well, right? So we want the best estimate of our aerosol state. But depending on from which angle we look, we might just see the dust if we just look at this supermicron, or we might just focus on the fractal. So there is no one instrument that could characterize the whole aerosol at once. So we need to patch our picture together with using different instruments. And on the modeling side, what this means with our low-dimensional projections of this really high-dimensional aerosol state, we are also losing facets of this true aerosol state. And so that's something that introduces uncertainties, and that we are, that is a challenge for us, both experimentalists and modelers. Okay, so a little bit more detail on how particle-resolved models work. So I already alluded to it. So we don't have any modes and we don't have size bins. Instead, excuse me, we have discrete computational particles which may represent a whole bunch of real particles, which we evolve in time according to the aerosol processes that we are including in our simulation. And so this outlines how the box model version works. So the part MC portion of the model takes care of the aerosol dynamics. So we have coagulation, we treat particle emissions, dilution with background, removal by deposition, and things like nucleation. That's done stochastically. It's sampling the population with the appropriate probabilities. And then this is coupled to a aerosol gas phase and gas phase chemistry and aerosol thermodynamics code called Mosaic, which was developed by Raoul Zaveri at PNNL and collaborators. And so if you have this sort of framework, it's very straightforward to represent mixing state, because you just let the particles do what they are supposed to do according to the processes that are outlined here. The downside is it's computationally, of course, expensive. We have to track a lot of things, and we have to perform the mosaic chemistry on each particle, which takes computational time, no question about this. And so some of these papers that are listed here describe methods how to accelerate what's going on in the model so that we can do all of this very efficiently. The governing equation looks like this. So this is how the high-dimensional size distribution, so mu would be our composition vector, how it changes in space and time. And so you see the aerosol processes, coagulation and emission, and the gas particle transfer, water uptake, the three bottom lines. But then there's also, in a 3D model, you have transport, right? So turbulent transport and transport due to advection, which we will get to in a second. And of course, we have the equation for our gas phase species, how they evolve, and the 3D fluid flow and temperature and moisture. And so starting out with this box model many years ago now, we have implemented PartMC into a meteorological host model called WRF, which many of you will know. So WRF simulates the wind field, the temperature, and the humidity. PartMC is still responsible for the aerosol dynamics and also simulates the transport of the particles, again, using stochastic methods. Mosaic still is doing the chemistry processes. When we simulate an episode, let's say, of a few days, we try to use as many processes as are necessary so that our simulation time stays under or is equal the actual wall time, right? So if we want to simulate 2 days, we only want to wait for the results for on the order of 2 days. And so we're using many cores on current supercomputers. And so there are billions and billions of particles being tracked in this simulation. And so this just shows a snapshot of our model domain. This is California. You can see the Bay Area there in the middle. And if we count up all our particles, we get the number concentration, right? So which many models can do, but in this case, we are actually literally following our computational particles through the model domain. And so the kind of information that we then can gain is, so if we zoom in on a certain location in our model domain, yes, we do know the number concentration, but we know exactly what the particles are composed of. So often what we would do, we plot our population in this two-dimensional histogram kind of way, where size is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is some other quantity. For example, in this case, it's the organic carbon mass fraction. So you can see at a given size, let's take 10 to the minus 7, so 100 nanometer, we have a whole spread of organic mass fractions. Some particles contain more and less of organic carbon. Of course, what else it contains is not shown on this middle plot, but we do know it, and we could make the same kind of plot for other chemical species. So we can pick a certain particle and see what's in it, so that's the top right plot. And we also, due to using the emission inventories in the way we are using them, track where each primary particle came from. And so this particular one that I highlighted there with a star has actually coagulated several times, and it contains contributions from all these different source categories. Okay, so how are we moving particles around? I already mentioned it's done stochastically, so we had to develop new algorithms for doing so. It's different compared to having a scalar like ozone concentration, right, where you can use finite volume methods to move your scalar around or advect it or turbulent diffuse it. So we are basically calculating the fluxes in and out from each grid cell as it's supposed to happen due to the turbulent diffusion coefficient and the wind speed. And then we interpret these fluxes as probabilities for the particles to move, and then we move them accordingly from one grid cell to the next. And we've done tests with these methods to make sure that they converge like they are supposed to. So on the top left, you see, again, a snapshot from a test simulation where we released a plume of particles in the middle of this model domain of California. So that's not, it's just doing advection in this case, no chemistry in this case. And we increased the number concentration of computational particles going from one simulation to the next. And then our error compared to the finite volume method should decrease with a proportional to 1 over square root the number of computational particles, which it does. And at the bottom, you see cross sections and a little time series where we plot the results using different numbers of computational particles and performing the same simulation many times. And you can see there is a stochastic noise associated with it, right? So this is different to, again, transporting scalars where you get one result. Here, you have to repeat the simulation, and then you can come up with a mean and a standard deviation. And the more particles you use, the smaller gets the noise. So there's that behavior associated with this. And one of the things that we do, I didn't really point this out explicitly, but we are not tracking the position of the particles within a grid cell. We just say, okay, this is our sample of particles, and at each time step when we have to move them, we move a subsample of them, randomly picked. And so we don't track the position, and the computational cost is proportional to the number of particles that is actually moving between grid cells, and not the total number of particles. And so I just put together a slide with a few examples how we have been using this model, right? So we have been using it in conjunction with chamber experiments, as you see on the bottom right, and in the middle bottom little picture from several of the publications. We've been using it to inquire what impact has black carbon mixing state on cloud activation. How many particles do we need to estimate mixing state reliably, and what are the errors associated with it? We have done a lot of work on understanding the aging timescale of black carbon in the atmosphere, looking at aqueous phase chemistry and cloud droplets, and studying the water uptake and optical properties of mixed organic and inorganic particles, just to show you a cross-section of what kind of applications we can use this modeling approach for. Now, talking a little bit more about this parametric and structural model uncertainty, or model uncertainty in general, and trying to explain in a little bit more detail where this uncertainty may be coming from. And so parametric and structural model uncertainty are two categories, what might happen. And so I try to summarize this in this slide. So parametric uncertainty happens if you settled on your model, and you have every model has a lot of parameters and constants in it, where we have to pick values. And sometimes there are uncertainties associated with what exact values to pick. And so therefore, we call this parametric uncertainty. How we can figure out how large this uncertainty is the model sensitive to which value I'm picking for any of these many parameters? Well, in principle, it's simple. We just vary the parameters and see what happens, right? In practice, this can involve many simulations, and it's computationally very demanding to thoroughly do this. And so Ken Karslow's group has devised a very elegant method how to deal with this. And so this paper that I listed here is summarizing this. So that's one category of uncertainties. The other category, structural uncertainty, has to do with that our underlying model does actually not fully describe the true system. And how we can assess this? Well, we can compare two measurements and see, okay, and figure out from this, there's one process missing or several processes missing. Or we can compare to benchmark models if such benchmark models are available. And so on the right-hand side, the structural uncertainty is what our work falls into, because the PART-MC particle resolved model is a kind of benchmark model with respect to mixing state. One thing that we are still not doing a great job on is taking account of the shape, right? So I've drawn our computational particles deliberately as little pie charts. So whenever shape comes into play, we still have to make assumptions. So let's just be very clear about this. And so what this exercise might look like, we might be interested, okay, I want to use a modal model in my global climate model. What is the error by just settling on this aerosol representation that I'm committing when I'm calculating CCN concentration, INP, or optical properties, any of these climate relevant properties? How much uncertainty do I commit by just doing away with all this complexity in terms of diversity of composition within modes? And so what we can do is we run a particle resolved approach and evaluate the same quantities, and then the difference that we get could be attributed to structural uncertainty due to aerosol representation. And so there are 3 steps in this strategy, how we do this. I already introduced this benchmark model that we use in this case, the PART-MC model, either as box model or within the regional scale embedded. We also need a metric that we can label our populations with. And that's the mixing state index chi, which I will explain next. And then we also need a little procedure called composition averaging that I will explain after this. Okay, so why do we need a metric, or what's the good thing about this metric for quantifying the aerosol state? So if I show you populations, if I say Donald, what would you say? Which one is external and which one is internal? So the left one is external, right? Yes, good. The right one is internal. That was easy. Everyone would probably be on board with this, right? Okay, how about this one? The left one? Still external, right? But it's somehow different than the top one, because the bottom one doesn't have the blue, right? It has only 2 species. And then the bottom right is still internal, right? But it's also different than the top one, because now they all look the same, but they don't have the same amount. So what do we call this? Is internal still the right word to use here? The answer is yes, but there's a but to it. Now, how about these ones? What do we call these? Yeah, so this is when things become tricky because they are somewhere in between. Okay, so it turns out that we are not the only people or the only community who has this problem in quantifying or describing diversity. It's the same, a very similar problem in ecology, where they describe, or they have to describe diversity in habitats. And so imagine you have different water holes in a certain area, and these water holes are inhabited by different animal species. And so on the top, you would have a representation of externally mixed water holes, where each water hole is only inhabited by one animal species. And then the internally mixed water holes have many animal species coexisting in one water hole. And so there was a lot of struggle and debate which metrics are really representing this feature best, going back to the 1950s. But by now, everyone is pretty much settled to use metrics in a certain way, and they're very applicable to aerosols. And so here it goes. This is how it goes. So it's based on diversity metrics that we have to start with individual particles. So we assign a diversity number to each particle, and without dwelling on the math, you can see how it goes. If a particle is pure, one species, the index is 1. If it has even amounts of 2 species, it's 2. If it has even amount of 3 species, it's 3. If it has even amount of 4 species, it's 4. Yes, exactly. You get the message. And so we can construct the in-between states as shown here, calculating what is called the mixing entropy. It's a Shannon entropy kind of measure, and then taking the exponential of that. Yeah, and so then you can view these numbers as units of effective species. And if you average all the DIs for the whole population, you get what they call, and we also now call, the alpha diversity of the population. So the higher the alpha diversity, the more complicated is each particle individually. But they could still all look the same, right? And so therefore, we also need to take the bulk into consideration. And so this is best illustrated by this 2-dimensional diagram, where the alpha diversity is on the x-axis and the diversity of the bulk, called gamma diversity, is on the y-axis. And so you can see if you go up the y-axis, you are adding pure particles, but you're adding more species, right? Going from 1 to 2 to 3 species. And as you go across, you make each particle more complicated. And so the most high entropy state is on the bottom right, where each particle contains the same mixture as the bulk. So this would be the perfect internal mixture. But if you go down that diagonal, all the particles look still identical. They are just less and less diverse. And then you can fill out this space with any combination in between. And so the mixing state index chi is basically the ratio of the d alpha to the d gamma. And chi of 0, this is constructed, so chi of 0 means external mixture, chi of 100% means complete internal mixture. Okay, so in our model world, this is relatively easy, or it's actually really straightforward to calculate. We track the mass fraction of species that are in each particle, so we can construct these diversity measures, no problem, and we can calculate a chi for our populations, no problem. In the measurement world, it's much more time-consuming, and it's a big effort, actually. And I'm just showing one example here where this has been done for the Go Amazon campaign, and several people involved in this study are probably in this room, where you determine from measurements what is the per particle diversities first, and so that's the middle panel right there, and you can see different locations have different distributions, and from there you can derive what is the mixing state metric and how are these populations situated in this two-dimensional d alpha and d gamma space, and how does it evolve in time, for example, how do different locations differ. And so over time, over the last few years, different groups have done this for different environments, and really complicated pictures emerge, right? So the mixing state varies depending on location, season, time of the day. You can pinpoint diurnal cycles. It varies in space. You see the map of Pittsburgh, where they constructed a map, a spatially resolved map of mixing state. It varies in vertically, right? So the next slide on the bottom, which is labeled with Mount Pico, and in the aerosols, they evaluated mixing state as they go from ground with a tethered balloon to higher altitudes. And so there is no simple message coming out here other than there's a lot going on, right? And so at any given point in time, mixing state evolves dynamically. One thing that is common to these, what we could say probably is that our model world of complete external and complete internal mixture is just a model assumption, right? In reality, this basically never happens. And so, as I mentioned, from our model simulations, we can make maps of mixing state as well. And so this again shows the model domain of California with the Bay Area here. And so we do see in areas of near to sources, we are fairly externally mixed, and going downwind, this is just one snapshot in time now here. As we go downwind and away from the sources, we reach more internal mixtures, which is consistent what the group at Carnegie Mellon found when they did this for Pittsburgh. Okay, so this was a short review of how we construct this measure, what is the mixing state of a population. Now, very quickly, the composition averaging, that's very simple. So on the left is, again, a depiction of what a population might look like. So you see it's a complicated mixing state. Now, composition averaging mean we keep the size of the particles the same, but we assign them the average composition. So basically the bulk composition to each particle, right? Pretending, okay, we don't care about what each particle is made of. We just treat every particle as being the same as each other, equal to the average. And so this really isolates the impact of mixing state on diagnostic properties such as CCN concentration, optical properties, heterogeneous reaction rates, what have you, because we do keep the size the same, and the total masses are also conserved, right? So it's really a redistribution of the components across the population. Okay, and so what we find then is we can come up with results like this. So again, we take each grid box from our California WRF PART-MC simulation, and then we calculate an error by comparing the true CCN concentration based on our best estimate, what the aerosol composition is in this given location, and comparing this to the composition averaged sister population, right? So, and then re-evaluating CCN concentration, we will get something different, obviously. And so, but how big is the difference? And so now it's drawn, or it's plotted across the true mixing state, going from externally mixed to internally mixed. Of course, if we have an internally mixed population, and we perform composition averaging, there won't be an error, so that goes to zero. But if we are fairly externally mixed, the error can be quite large, up to 200% for really quite externally mixed populations. We can do the same thing for optical properties. So here I'm showing the mixing state index on the x-axis, and then the relative error in absorption coefficient. So this is the absorption coefficient of the aerosol population. And again, for internally mixed populations, the error is 0, and then it increases towards the external mixture to on the order of 80%. And how much time do I have? I don't have 6 minutes? Okay. So this shows how PartMC can be used for verification, right? So PartMC would be used as our benchmark model, and we can verify these more simplified models, which need to be used in global models so that we can perform the simulation in a reasonable time at reasonable computational expense. Now we also know what error is associated with them. In the last 5 minutes, I want to spend some time on showing you how we can use PartMC information for coarse graining our results. And so what that means is it would be really nice to use our simplified models, but somehow infuse them with the knowledge or inform them with the knowledge that we have based on our particle resolved simulations. And so this can be done for processes such as coagulation or aerosol gas partitioning, or for diagnostic quantities like CCN concentration and aerosol optical properties, or the mixing state itself. Okay, and so one example I want to show, and this study was done by Laura Fierce, where we looked at the absorption enhancement of black carbon particles. And what you find is if you construct your absorption enhancement of the population using the individual particle absorption enhancement, you get a different result compared to if you use the population average. And so that has been a long-standing problem, and still is a long-standing problem if you work with these more simplified models. And why is this bias? And so Laura was able to tease out that it comes because we are in the simplified modal models, we are distributing the coding not in the right way compared to what a particle resolved model would tell us, and therefore we are overestimating the absorption of the particles that are containing large amount of black carbon. And so to fix this, she used PartMC simulations, many PartMC simulations, and then she did a kernel regression using the actual absorption enhancement that come out of the per particle simulations. And from that, you can derive a non-parametric relationship that uses as input something that the coarser models knows. So these are the quantities in the blue box. So in a coarse model, in a modal model, we do know volume fraction of dry coatings, the total, and we know the hygroscopicity. We actually know quite a few things, and sticking this through this non-parametric relationship gives us a predicted absorption enhancement that we really want, which is informed by PartMC results. And this is what this looks like on the global scale using output from NASA GISS. So on the right-hand side, it's doing the naive way, assuming uniform composition of coatings across all black carbon cores, and the middle is our best estimate. So you see how the absorption enhancement is much lower than in the original case. And the last example here is, can we construct a mixing state map across the whole globe, right? So we cannot run PartMC in a global model just yet. Then we could do it brute force. And so to circumvent this, we can also build an emulator for the mixing state metric. So here now our diagnostic quantity is chi, the mixing state metric. The training data, again, is PartMC, many PartMC box model simulations. And we feed this emulator things that a global model knows, such as bulk aerosol concentration, gas phase concentration, etc. And then we construct this mixing state map in that way without explicitly running PartMC. And then we get results like this, right? So we have areas on the globe with more or less internally and externally mixed regions. And we can compare this to what a modal model, MAM4 in this case, would estimate. So we can calculate the same thing. And there you see now the structural uncertainty, right? So MAM4 thinks the aerosol is much more internally mixed in low latitudes and much more externally mixed in high latitudes compared to what our PartMC-based emulator would estimate. Okay, and so this brings me to the summary slide. So what I was trying to explain today was how particle resolved modeling can bridge scales in aerosol science. And so it's a useful tool in the model hierarchy to quantify structural uncertainty and to really take the particle scale data and knowledge to the larger scales by using these modeling techniques. And it's now actually feasible to use this kind of model in a 3D Eulerian chemical transport model, not just a box model. And PartMC is open source. We have a website called Open Atmos where different institutions post or host their open source code related to particles, clouds, and aerosols. And we have also been working on developing a Python-based Jupyter Notebook PartMC version, which you are welcome to check out. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Nicole, for a very, very nice talk. I would open the floor for some questions. There are some microphones dispersed through the room. So if you have some questions, you can start walking towards one of those microphones so everybody can hear that. And while some people are, starting the question, I guess that I will start with the first one, Nicole. It's a two-part question. The transition to get PartMC to the bigger models, right? You say we are not there, we have to come to other things. So the first part of the question is, how far are we? I would say like a factor of 2 computationally, is it a factor of 2 million computationally? How far are we? And the second part, which I thought was very interesting, you mentioned that in order to overcome those computational needs, you're entering some, machine learning tools to get into that. So, of course, I'm super curious about what are some of those tools, if you can comment on that.
Oh, yeah, that's a very exciting topic and a really good question. So how far are we away? So I did show we can run a particle-based model within WRF, right, which is a regional scale model. And there's no reason why we couldn't implement it into a global model as well, which doesn't actually have that many more grid boxes compared to WRF, which really has a small, like 4 by 4 kilometers, right? So if you just make your grid size big, fine. The thing is that we could only run a few days, maybe up to a week or 2 weeks, right? If we wanted to run what climate modelers are interested in several months or a year or many years, that's when it becomes really infeasible right now. And so the bottleneck really is the chemistry. So if we could figure out a way, which some people are trying to figure out, how to run the chemistry on GPU, that would completely put us into a different field of game. And yeah, the machine learning, I think there's a lot of scope there to learn, rather than hand placing our modes, which we have been doing out of necessity. We had to make decisions, right? Where are the modes? What do the modes contain? How do they interact? Rather than doing this crafted, doing something based on machine learning. So that is an avenue for the next generation or even this generation to work on. I think that would be really exciting.
Very good. Thank you, Nicole. I think we have a question right here in the middle.
Hello.
Hey, Nicole. That was an absolute pleasure for that presentation. As an observationalist, I can't help but thinking that a lot of our instrumentation are also lower dimensional projections on the actual physical space. So I just wanted to get your take on, to what extent can we use these higher resolution models, given their parametric and structural uncertainty, to accurately inform instrument design, sampling strategies, things like that?
Yeah, wow, you're asking the $1 million question here. And you are completely right. I forgot to say this actually when I showed my model aerosol state. This completely totally applies to measurements too, right? We have bulk measurements, we have size resolved composition measurements. Those are also capturing low dimensional manifestations of the high dimensional aerosol space. So I think what needs to be done really is to, and people are doing this already, so trying to merge the different instruments so that we can get a good picture of the whole elephant and not just one tail or one ear, right? And that comes with challenges because even like stitching together a size distribution, as you know, right? The different diameters involved, they need to be brought onto the same common level. And so if you take even more different instruments, it becomes even more difficult, but I think this is what is needed to really characterize the aerosol space. So the multi-instrumentation deployment, which is also a logistic coordination challenge. Yeah.
Hi, Joel Corbin, National Research Council. Thanks for a great talk, Nicole. So you mentioned the importance of morphology at one point, and I wanted to ask you, how important do you think, how important do you think it is to look more into that? Or more specifically, you showed the example for black carbon's mixing state.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure what morphology you assume there, and if we then answer that question, do you expect a big change?
Yeah. So morphology is another facet of, of all of this, and I haven't had time to go much into this. So as I mentioned, though, with our modeling approach right now, we still have to assume a morphology when it comes to calculating things like absorption. And right now, we assume spherical particles, the black carbon is in the core, and we have a spherical coating around it, right? And so what we gain above more simplified model approaches is that we actually do know a realistic-ish distribution of the coating thicknesses, right? So we don't have to assume that. We get that much more reliable, but still we deal with spherical particles. And there have been studies where people use more sophisticated optical models compared to me models, which is what we use, right? So T-matrix or DDA, and they do find differences. It's a structural uncertainty of our model and something that we need to pay attention to, especially for optical properties. I think it's very important.
Thanks, Nicole. This is Yaowei Li from Harvard University. So I'm just wondering, like you mentioned, even it's actually sort of relevant to the morphology question. So even with this very sophisticated particle resolved model you mentioned, it doesn't, if I understand correctly, it doesn't really resolve like the location of different composition within a single particles, like co-shell or like those. So I'm just wondering, is how critical, like, would you think to like explicitly resolve those like details within a single particles, and is there any efforts going on?
Yes, there are efforts going on. I know that the group by Manabu, Shiraiva, for example, at UC Irvine, they have, it comes down to basically representing the aerosol not like as a solid sphere or whatever you want to call it, or liquid sphere, but having layers, right? So kind of like an onion, to go with this analogy, and to really resolve what's structurally going on within the particle. We are going towards this direction, but we haven't really completed it, so I can't speak to it from my own experience, but for many questions about viscosity and how gases are diffusing into the particle and liquid-liquid phase separation, all these questions, it is important to look at these details, right? And so then after you study it, you can decide if it's worth, if you are willing to commit the error or not. And so I think all these studies are very interesting and very worthwhile as well, complementing or getting a real picture of what the aerosol looks like and what the impacts are.
Thank you.
Nicole, and we have one more question, and then of course, you know, I'm sure Nicole will be happy to answer even additional questions afterwards. So.
Hi, Nicole. This is Zheng Chen from EMSO.
Hey.
And a very nice talk. And
Thank you.
I just want to ask one general question. So our group is doing a lot of individual particle measurements. So can you comment on how we can use individual aerosol measurement to help improve the mixing state, and how do you utilize this in the model?
Yeah, so these measurements are really important to tell us what is there. What is the mixing state? Like if I, hopefully over time, we will be able to fill out this map, which had a big question mark, right? Now we can simulate it with our model tools, but validating these robustly, like having big databases with, and having a common metric that we all use so that we can compare to each other. I think that is currently something that we should strive towards too, right? And we are not quite there yet, but I think it's very possible with all the work that you and others are doing in this community.
Thank you.
All right, before we go on to the final part of this morning plenary session, which is the Friedlander and Hearing Award presentation, let's thank Nicole one more time.
Thank you, everybody.
Good morning. So Jackie was not able to be here today, so I'll be presenting